Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. The New Stack thanks the Code team for sponsoring our podcast from KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con in Austin, Texas. Learn more about the open source projects Code is supporting and its team of passionate open source engineers and advocates building community through contribution and engagement in emerging technologies. Learn more about Code at thecodeteam.com. End of the show here, and we have probably the biggest panel we've had so far of folks to talk about cloud native and talk about cloud native storage, and we have some book authors. Yeah. So why don't we introduce ourselves and start with Clint right here, and we'll go around.
All right, I'm Clint Kitson. I'm the technical director for Code, which is the open source initiative at Dell Tech.
Awesome. Hi, I am Kris Nova. I work at Heptio. I'm one of the authors of Cloud Native Infrastructure, and I do a ton of open sourcey Kubernetes work in my free time.
I'm Justin Garrison. I'm also co-author of Cloud Native Infrastructure and super involved in Kubernetes community and CNCF. Been here around for a while.
Steve Watts. I work at Red Hat in emerging technologies, and I work in the Kubernetes multi-cluster and storage SIG.
Oh, awesome.
So I'd like to start with the book author. So when you guys were putting this book together and you're thinking about all the different kinds of ways you can do this book, because it gets, putting together a book is no easy task. Like we put together these ebooks and it takes months and months and months to do, right? And you go through rewrites and everything else. How did you think about storage in the context of this book when you're writing the cloud infrastructure book? How did it fit? How did you approach the topic? I'm curious about that.
Of storage?
Yeah, storage overall.
Storage overall. So, I don't think we really explicitly called out how to manage storage necessarily in our book, ever.
We call out state, but not
state.
We tried as much as possible to stay with loose patterns, and in cloud native, you are using a cloud, so you're going to use a cloud provider's version of whatever it is, and we try to not call out products as much as we call out patterns.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in dealing with, especially with infrastructure, not applications. Applications typically need more storage requirements. Infrastructure provides that, but you're getting that from a cloud provider of some sort.
That really speaks to the change in language, I think, that we're seeing kind of with the emergence of cloud native technologies, where we're starting to see, for instance, I was talking about it earlier, service mesh technologies kind of harken back to TCP/IP in some respects, but it's nothing like that, really. You have other terminology that has changed quite a bit. I guess the question then, what for you all, because I am interested in how the container ecosystem is maturing, and how the terminologies are changing. How do you think of then, storage and cloud native kind of in the same, as a concept? Clint, you work with the container storage interface group quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we look at Kubernetes. One of the key things that it's doing is it's abstracting any of the infrastructure services right into a common API. And one of those key things that supports applications can be storage, along with networking and compute and everything else. And so that pattern of being able to dynamically manage an application and be able to have portability and a lot of these things that cloud native enables, storage is a key aspect to that.
Yeah. Patterns is the key here, isn't it? Patterns is one of those terms you hear quite a bit when you're talking about the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Right, and at the application or at the infrastructure layer, you just need super stable interfaces to provide you that stuff. So storage interface is one of those things that is providing it, and really, the standard is what you need. Applications can use higher level abstractions on top of that.
Mm-hmm. What's the perspective, the Red Hat perspective? What's your perspective on this?
I think our perspective, think about, there's sort of two tiers. There's application persistence. So, if you're running your cloud native applications, you're going to often use what the cloud provider offers in their service catalog, whether it's some sort of message queue or NoSQL system or something to do your persistence. I think that's one aspect. The storage SIG in Kube doesn't actually focus that much on that. Instead, we're if you want to run Cassandra in Kubernetes, you need a lot more of the lower level services like block, file, and object, and so we focus a lot on exposing the sort of lower level real storage plumbing available to data management platforms so that applications can then use those data management platforms for persistence.
So tell us more about the SIG than the storage SIG.
Well, Kubernetes is divided into many different sort of functional areas it's tackling. It's a huge project, right? And so there's a networking SIG and a multi-cluster SIG, and the storage SIG is just a group of folks that have a mutual interest in sort of advancing the storage roadmap in Kubernetes. We had a face-to-face content I went to the other day. We were joking around like it's a mini conference. There's 50 people there. So it's the entire vendor ecosystem, traditional, usual folks that, are here, but also NetApp and, Dell EMC and Red Hat as well. And basically, there's a storage subsystem in Kubernetes called the Persistent Volume Framework. And that group of folks basically works on that and improves that, and as well as adds storage operation features like snapshotting and cloning. Really excited about. It's counterintuitive. I was joking with Clint about this, but we just enabled block storage, which is counterintuitive because it sounds like that old school storage snorage, boring stuff, but
storage snorage.
But actually, block enables virtualization on Kubernetes for the KubeVirt project. So you can do all kinds of really amazing things with Kube now, like scheduling containers and VMs.
Okay. So I would like to talk about the book you guys wrote. I wish I had a copy of it to show actually right here. Can you tell us about the book? What's the title? What was your approach? What is it that you were trying to do with in writing it? Who's it for?
Sure. Okay, so how the whole kind of thing happened was Justin had reached out to me. He had already kind of started the journey of exploring what it was going to take to write a book and had a little bit of an idea in mind.
Small piece.
He knew he wanted to move into the infrastructure space, which is how I think he found me, because that's really what I have sort of been doing for the past couple of years. So we sort of started jumping on calls and brainstorming, and what started out as a very small GitHub README ultimately over the course of 6 months turned into the book that we were signing just a few minutes ago. Yeah. And I think as far as the audience goes, for me personally, and I think Justin and I have a little bit different personal reasons why we wanted to write the book. But for me, I really wanted to give infrastructure and infrastructure engineers an opportunity to sort of swing with the application engineers and really bring this infra layer that could be anything from storage to networking to a virtual machine load balancer, pretty much anything that's going to help run and support your app, and really start writing software as infrastructure engineers to manage that layer. And traditionally, the DevOps infrastructure people have always kind of been late to the party. So giving them a head start and helping them really get ahead was really important to me.
Yeah, for me, it was really about giving back to the community and just leveling up where everyone was at, because there was so many people doing it in ways that I thought was wrong, where the people keep failing over and over again, or reproducing what they have on-prem and just doing that in the cloud. And that's not, from my perspective, how people have been successful with it. How the Netflixes and the Googles and the Amazons. That's not how they've done it to be successful. And so we're really trying to bring people building infrastructure up a higher notch to say, don't do it all these ways. Learn from these patterns that you can see inside of Kubernetes and these other projects.
I read it from front to back, and I thought it was a great book. And it rang true to me, when we look at DevOps teams and organizations for the past few years, they've specialized in gluing things together. And software is not easy, right? And being able to capture all these patterns and capture how the pioneers have done things in software like Kubernetes is really going to enable us to build new technology that's going to make a difference. So I love the book. It was great.
Awesome. Thanks. One of the things I really like about what we talk about in the book, and even solving infrastructure as software in general, is this idea that I've been obsessing over for a couple of years, which is what we call in the book the bootstrap problem, which says in order for you to manage infrastructure with software, you need to first be able to run that software somewhere in the first place. So experimenting with different patterns and ideas about bootstrapping your initial infrastructure, to me that's I haven't really seen the golden answer to that yet. I still think there's a lot of work to be done in that space, and I'm really curious to see what the community will come up with over the next year or two on solving that problem.
So what what have you, just going back to the book again, one of the things that I've always found in writing, it helps me understand things better. That's one reason I got involved as a technology reporter and covering the enterprise, because I wanted to try to understand this stuff better, because I just was curious about it. I'm curious what you learned in the process about your own understanding of the ecosystem overall, and how that is trying to change your perspectives or built upon it.
We had a draft of the book that we basically threw away, which was very project focused, and I think as we threw that away and we realized everything we wrote was out of date already, we realized how much it shouldn't be about a project or a technology. It is about the patterns, and
right.
It's about the hard things that we keep solving over and over again.
Right.
And that was a big learning thing about just what you're focusing on and where you're providing value. And the second thing for me that I learned was cloud native is almost as much, almost more about people and culture as it is about technologies. Yeah. And if you have the culture that wants a cloud native type of environment, then you will use technologies that it's easier to change the people than it is the technologies, or harder to change the people. Sorry.
In the storage thing, are these issues that come up?
Well, there's certainly sort of traditional non-cloud native vendors trying to figure out how to integrate themselves into this cool new space. Yeah. So there's plenty of that, and it's true. I mean, I think it's even in my sort of my own personal journey into this, like, I totally concur with what you said, and I'm still learning, like and the storage SIG itself is still learning around like patterns, right? Like, I'll tell you one thing that's really interesting, right? Like, the old school way of people managing storage is like you submit a ticket to some storage administrator that like creates you the storage, and then like maybe the next day you get it back, like the cloud native ways, like EBS has an API, right? Like, you can just create storage on demand, right? And we took that in Kubernetes and adopted that same pattern, and it's sort of revolutionary for the storage industry in that, like, we've taken the power for doing lifecycle storage management and put it in the hands of the developer. It's no longer the purview of the administrator, right? But that's something that sort of reflects a more cloud native approach. It's like, get the administrators out of the way of the developers being productive.
So this really resonates with me. Before I worked at Microsoft, I worked for SolidFire, a really, really successful storage company that went through acquisition into NetApp. And my whole job was to be an administrator for the software engineers who were vendoring and dogfooding our storage systems. And as I started to automate that and build out these like really complex topologies on virtual machines, like real virtual machines on real bare metal, not the fake ones in the cloud, building out this topology, I began to naturally find myself coding myself out of a job. And a lot of the developers I worked with started to use my tools to vendor storage themselves. And it was like, that's when I kind of had that aha moment of, this is what cloud native is and this is what it means. So yeah.
Yeah, I think when you start to build on top of that too, like, you've got some amazing foundation, you've got storage extensibility, you've got Kubernetes exposing this in a somewhat standard way, and the applications that you can start putting on top of this infrastructure become very, very powerful. Like, when you've got the elasticity of a cloud and you've got the on-demand capability the clouds provide, and you expose that to an app and allow an app to start managing it itself, you take things that are typically very, very complex, which took many scripts to manage in SolidFire, for example,
right.
And you've empowered them by giving them any resources they want at any time, and you've made a great application.
For me, it was like the moment where like it went from a human coming over to me and then me running a script to me getting taken out of the equation and either a human or another piece of software calling my script, and then it was like, what's my job here? I wrote the script and now I'm done, right? Like, so it was really weird.
So what happened to the job?
Right. Well, so ultimately, I had moved on and started working in Kubernetes and letting go, and here I am.
Is that how you came to discover?
I think it was a necessary
process
part of the journey.
Yeah.
It was kind of like I had to spend a good year and a half, like, writing automation tooling for virtual machines, and then when something broke, like, going to the data center and like badging in and walking upstairs and like like sitting in the cold, and, like, fixing a server. So, yeah. And then so like now like it's like, oh man, something broke. Let me just like destroy it with immutable infrastructure, and then poof, it'll recreate itself, and like I'm done. And like I did all that with a cup of coffee in my hand.
It sounds like you're on some Star Wars desolate planet.
Oh yeah.
I had joked a while ago that DevOps was always about automating yourself out of the job, and Cloud Native is about declaring yourself out of a job.
That's brilliant.
That's the line of the day right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So that there's so many paths to discovery here. I mean, what are some of the newer paths that you're starting to discover now? I mean, all of you, please chime in. I mean, because this event to me has just been a whole new set of discoveries for me around, thinking more about service mesh technologies, or thinking more about storage, or thinking more about the SIGs and how they're working inside, the Kubernetes community, and this idea of a steering group, and and values, and the people and the roles. I'm just curious on where your paths are now. What is it that you're finding, as you kind of make your way, because it's a constant process.
I think in the storage space, we've been having a lot of discussions about what is cloud native storage. Just pretty basic. Let's apply the patterns of cloud native to storage and what that means for applications. An area that I think that we're starting to recognize is the world that Steve and I live in sometimes, the block world. That's foundational, I think, to building applications and building some of these applications you rely on that provide persistent services. So when you go to like a big cloud, maybe it's EBS volumes, and maybe it's like DynamoDB that sits on top of that at some point. Like figuring out like how to create the data services that also empower applications is going to be very, very important. So cloud data storage is not the term of 20 years ago from what we thought storage was, spinning disks and blocks. It's more of a progressive thing that encapsulates how any application is going to interact with storing information in whatever way they want to. I think that's a really interesting area that we're focusing on coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is like a very Red Hat point of view, I have to say, because we're always obsessed with like allowing people to run their applications anywhere, where a lot of like folks are like really comfortable with just being like, I'm just gonna run in Amazon and I'm okay, like getting hopelessly locked in because I get like amazing time to solution with them and their service catalog's amazing. But like we're very focused on like actually allowing you to use like the platform abstractions that Kubernetes gives you to like move your apps anywhere. But the problem with that is you get data lock-in. And I think like this is like a really interesting, this is a thing that like I wake up to like go do every day, is like solve that problem, right? In the community, in the open source community, right? It's like be able to like move your app and the data with it from like Amazon to Google to on-premise, etc., and move around. So I think that's like as far as like paths forward, like I'm psyched to like go work on that problem with the community.
It's that portability then. It's that
application portability.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. How about you, Kris? What are some of the things that you're learning just here at a show like this, like that help you to provide some retrospective on your own path, kind of in this community?
I think there's a lesson I've been kind of obsessing over maybe the past 3 months or so, and I've really seen it resonate here, and seen a lot of new ideas come out of this conference, like this week alone. And this is the idea of really starting to explore like what the future of the Kubernetes APIs are and why they're so important. And you'll hear a lot of people draw this comparison against like the Linux API or even glibc, and saying that maybe the Kubernetes API is like the glibc API of the cloud, and that's how we're going to start doing things like managing storage and application portability, or it could be the network layer, or it could be the application layer. But having this API where we're like, I mean, look at it, we have Amazon, we have Google, we have Microsoft, we have Oracle, like all the big names in tech, Red Hat, are all coming together and kind of shaking their head and saying, yeah, this API makes sense. And that's kind of what happened around the Linux API. So knowing that that's going to be here and that's going to scale, the implementation is, of course, subject to change over time. But now we're starting to explore these ideas that like Tim and Ruben were talking about in their talk today about like Kubernetes distributions, right? Like what are the different flavors of Kubernetes and what does that mean? And to me, this is like level 2 cloud native, right? Like we're kind of like going to the next step where these resources, like the implementation, like it matters and it's important if that's important to you, but really they're all kind of same and unimportant at the end of the day, because really the API is what really needs to happen. And then you can have a strongly opinionated implementation of that that's meaningful to your company or your open source project or whatever.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
I mean, coming here, I'm just amazed from last year how much the community's grown, and I've been really trying to just engage with the community more and more and make sure that we're onboarding people correctly into this community to make sure that not only do we keep it open to new ideas, and we'll be stronger the more diverse and more people we get into this community.
Right.
And so I'm really trying to take a step back and remember what it was like 2 years ago to get started. Obviously, it's different now because almost every provider has a hosted click a button, get Kubernetes.
Right.
But what are people struggling with now? And trying to figure that out and making sure that we get people into the ecosystem and into the community to be able to give back and make sure that companies can see the value in giving back to the community and not just trying to fork it and run their own thing, and really gain a lot of information and a lot of knowledge and move things forward by getting all that diverse knowledge and all those different workloads and making the community stronger and the product stronger.
That's what really resonates, I think, for me at least. I mean, in the discussions I've had this week, I've been thinking a lot about values, right? And what are the values of an organization, and how do they reflect upon the organization and their overall mission and their goals and objectives. And that seems to me one of the most critical things right now in the Kubernetes community is, really defining those values and defining, so when those new people do come in, and when you're kind of considering kind of what your course is in the SIG or what the course is in the steering committee, there's like this common understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve, what it is that the community is trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think the CNCF has been really good about being so open, managing the projects and how they are structured to be able to do everything in the open. There's not hidden agendas, and everyone can be upfront about those things. But we do need to make sure that in the community we reinforce the type of behavior and interactions with people that are good and that are healthy for the community, because otherwise it can devolve and things can flame out really quickly if it's a bad experience or a bad community to be part of.
So, I mean, because as this community grows, and like, as you were saying, is like, Kris, you were saying, for example, that if we are indeed talking about Kubernetes becoming like this, like universal API, really, right? Across, and we have this general acceptance, universal acceptance from the Alibabas, the Tencent, the Google, the Amazon Web Services, Microsofts of the world, the Dells. Then that has to kind of make you think that the problems are going to scale, right? And so I'm curious, like, for instance, from a storage perspective, what are those problems that you see scaling that you're going to have to continually to be watching, as we kind of move forward?
I think one of the things that we're actually tackling right now to help that is just making sure that there's a common understanding of what storage should be in cloud native. I think just like the patterns that are described in the book, like what does that mean to this area of storage? And if everybody can share their ideas, and put this down on paper, and I think that's the foundation that we need to be able to move forward and help scale. If we don't do that, then we tend to have conversations over and over and over again,
right? And
don't make progress.
And that's when everything just kind of stops.
Yeah.
And we see this with the talk I gave earlier today about an infrastructure cluster API for Kubernetes as a whole, which is we have all these deployment tools that don't subscribe to a shared API for everyone, and the community is very much fragmented. The user experience is very different, and everything is sort of this standalone island that you can't plug into anything else. It's just like you can use that and only that, or you can use something else and only that something else. So looking at storage and saying like, hey, we're starting to unify these ideas and creating modular interfaces to plug stuff together with, that's cloud native in my eyes anyway.
Yeah, the composability of the stack. I think technically that's how we help it scale.
Yep.
Right. Right. How about you? What are some of for either of you? What are some of the challenges you see ahead in terms of scaling issues that will be required for you to really start to think about it? For me, they always creep up, right? Like it's like, oh, that's an issue. I'm seeing that issue we see that in our daily lives all the time, right? So I'm just curious on, as Kubernetes and as the cloud native community really, really starts to grow, what are those scaling issues that keep thinking about in the back of your head?
Yeah, I think there's some dragons down the road as far as so like right now, a lot of like the actual like SIGs, like the people that show up for the SIGs, they're big. I mean, there's 30, 40 people sometimes. The people that are actually doing the code, it's like sometimes 10% of that, right, in each SIG. And I think Kubernetes as a community needs to get better about onboarding actual contributors. So that's the one thing. And then I think, you know, we're going from sort of micro-management processes when we were a small community to like this gnarly, huge community that we've become. And like we're going to have to change, like becoming more efficient as a macro sort of community. So I think there's some challenges down the road, especially around like governance and like how you run fast at that size. And I think when I think of Kube, I actually think of like the Linux community, right? Like, I think that it's a huge sort of like, you got all these packages and the kernel and like trying to get everything to work together. Like that's where we're headed. Like as far as like all these different SIGs, like it's a platform that can run any workload. Like that's really exciting, but also slightly terrifying from a governance perspective about like how we keep everything together. That's the negative take. Just kidding.
Yeah. No, like SIGs are the new subsystems, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, SIGs are the new subsystems. So that's great.
I think it's interesting though.
Catchphrase right there.
Yeah, with the CSI as an example, you know, building a proper interface, it allows you to have the right conversations inside the SIG. Because I think the wrong conversation is a storage vendor coming in saying, I want to be in the project, and here's what needs to happen, or here's how I get implemented. And the right conversation is, well, what do apps need from storage? And how do we enable that feature through interfaces? And so I feel like there's dragons, but things are heading the right direction, especially with CSI coming out in 1.9. Yeah.
I think having an interface and an API and a consumable library for any piece of software, especially anything written in Go nowadays, is sort of a standard. And you see this in Kubernetes where like we've kind of gone the other way and we like wrote the tool first as a command line tool, and then like now we're kind of trying to backpedal a little bit and say, okay, we need to write this as a library so that other tools can vendor it. And you see this in kubeadmin that works great at the command line, but trying to vendor it into another piece of software that maybe like rebrands how we want to enter this code base. We're trying to kind of second guess ourselves there and come back and redo a lot of that. So again, these are lessons we saw in Linux and that we're going to see moving forward.
Well, great. That's fantastic. This has been a really fun conversation to end the KubeCon Cloud Native Con conference. I want to thank you all for joining us, and 2018 is going to be a fun year. We didn't even get to container identity, which is an issue I think that's going to be fun to watch and narrate as in the new year. So you all have great happy holidays, and
thanks.
And we'll see you again soon.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah.
The NewStack thanks the Code team for sponsoring our podcast from KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con in Austin, Texas. Learn more about the open source projects Code is supporting and its team of passionate open source engineers and advocates building community through contribution and engagement in emerging technologies. Learn more about Code at thecodeteam.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.